My name's Louise Pulford. I'm the CEO at the Social Innovation Exchange, or SIX. We're a global network or a movement advocating for social innovation, or to use innovation to solve biggest societal challenges. We do many things, and we're interested in how big institutions can embed social purpose and innovation in their work. And so it's a pleasure today to be having a conversation with these three amazing people. Partnering with purpose is what we're going to talk about. And the focus of today's conversation is how different, three very different companies practice partnering with purpose with their own constituents. So rather than me talking too much, I'm going to introduce the panel, and they will answer a question and introduce themselves at the same time. We want this to be a conversation between us and with the participants, of course, who are joining too. And so we'll keep it relaxed. They've been briefed to ask each other questions as well, so you won't only hear me asking the panelists. And we hope that your questions as the participants can come in during the session so that we'll incorporate them into the conversation as we go. So don't feel like you have to hold back until everyone's finished before you can say anything. Please do contribute in the chat. And tell us where you're joining from as well. Of course, we like to know who's listening in and who's participating. So without further ado, let's get down to it. So we have Marissa Nobauer, who is Director of Reconciliation, Community Engagement and External Relations at TELUS in Canada. Chris Gale from the UK, Head of Circular Innovation and Impact at eBay UK, and Matty McEvoy, who's the CEO of Togetherall in the US. So let me first ask you, and I'll start with you, Marissa, but let me first ask you what this phrase, partnering with purpose, means to you. And I'll ask you to tell us a bit more about the organization and the role you play within the context of partnering with purpose as well. So Marissa, over to you, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I'm one of the 8 a.m. crew here. So I'm going to introduce myself as I tend to introduce myself when I'm making calls here in Canada. So my name is Marissa Nobauer, and I'm calling into you today from the unceded territory of the Quaquitlam First Nation here on the west coast of Canada in a town known as Coquitlam. And I work for TELUS. And what is TELUS? TELUS is a lot of things, but inherently at its core, TELUS is a connectivity company. And we provide telecommunication services to individuals across Canada. But we really look at what is and how do you leverage that technology for good, right? So once you have connectivity, once you have high-speed internet, once you have mobility services, how do you create better outcomes for your communities, for your businesses? And so when you look at the investment portfolio of TELUS and what we do today, we have a significant agriculture business. We have a significant health business. And it all comes back to how do we invest in technologies that leverage telecommunications to provide good for our communities. So for example, here in British Columbia, where I live, there's a huge portion of people that live in rural and remote communities and don't necessarily have access to everyday doctors. So, we've invested in an app that allows people to see the doctor from their home and not have to travel 4 hours to the nearest doctor in the closest town. What do I do? So I have a really interesting position here at TELUS. So I'm the director of TELUS's reconciliation strategy. And so essentially what that means is here in Canada, we have a responsibility as Canadian organizations to support reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So there was a call from the government and Indigenous peoples in 2015 called the 94 Calls to Action, established by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that really put out the moral imperative to corporations, to governments, to the nonprofit sector, to individuals, to all play our role in reconciling the shared history of this country, and to create a better country moving forward, inclusive of Indigenous peoples. So I have a really exciting role to play in terms of embedding TELUS's commitment to reconciliation across our business. And it's a really exciting role as well, because TELUS inherently is a social purpose company. So we always think about, and we always look to embed our commitments to social purpose in our business. What are the intersections between our business and how we can create good? And I was thinking about it in the context of your question, Louise, what is partnering with purpose? And I had a couple thoughts about that. I think fundamentally, partnering with purpose is ensuring that your commitment to social purpose is embedded in all aspects of your organization. Everyone in your company should know what your social purpose is. Everyone should be able to participate in your social purpose in a way, whether it's through volunteering, whether it's through giving back to the community. What are the opportunities that everybody in the company can play? And I think the other piece of it is understanding what the intersections are between your business and what you hear from communities. And I'll give you an example, my favorite example, one that's close to my heart. So we have a portfolio of programs at TELUS called Connecting for Good. And they're all about, accessibility for internet is great, but only if you can afford it, right? So what are the opportunities that we have as an organization to leverage our technology to support affordability? And so we have programs called Connecting for Good, which provides discounted or free plans to kids that have aged out of the foster care system, low-income elders. And we were looking at that program, and we were looking at it in the context of our reconciliation strategy and going, well, how do we make this more accessible? What are we hearing from Indigenous communities in terms of what they want to hear from us? And one of the big things and one of the big problems here in Canada is an ongoing epidemic of violence against Indigenous women and girls. And so one of the things we heard is, how do we make sure we get devices into the hands of women and girls that are in danger, fleeing, or surviving violence? And so we took these programs and we kind of overlaid what we can do. And now we have partnerships with Indigenous organizations across the country where we provide the phones, we provide the technology, and those organizations go out and provide the phones to those Indigenous women who are in need or surviving violence, right? So it's the best of both worlds. It's those intersections between our business, but it's also putting the ownership of who gets those phones in the hands of those organizations on the ground. So I'll take a pause because I think it was probably more than 5 minutes, and I'll turn it over to the next person.
Oh, Marissa, thank you so much. There's so much in there that we can dive deeper into as we go into the conversation. One of the things I love about the work that you do at TELUS, and I think is so important in this conversation going forward, is how connected it is to the business, the work that you do. It's not about trying to do community engagement somewhere else. It's directly connected to your core work. And so thank you for that. And I look forward to diving into those examples. Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what your role is, and what partnering with purpose means in that context?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Chris. I head up circular innovation and impact at eBay. I'm sure everyone knows eBay. We're basically a big marketplace selling things. And I think, so focusing more on the purpose bit to begin with, and I'll chat a little bit around what we do at eBay. I think, to your point, Louise, it's really about using your skills and tools that you have as a business to deliver impact. It's not about coming up with some random idea that in a moment in time feels good to those people that are coming up with the strategy, and then those people leave and you're back to square one and you think, what is this purpose thing again? It's got to be like, what is your starting point? And for eBay, that's always been around economic opportunity for all, which makes sense. But then that's very lofty. So what does that actually mean for us at eBay? For us at eBay in the UK, it's been about how do we support economic opportunity for underserved communities? So this sort of narrowing on underserved communities. And then really using our business to take action, so actually to do things, but also to be an advocate for change. And I think once you've got to be more of an advocate for change, and I think we've still got a long way to go on that point, to be perfectly honest. But as soon as you position yourself as being an advocate for change, you've got to get out there and be vocal about what you support. And again, when we're sort of developing the strategy, I always think there's two ways you can go. One is around what do our consumers care about, and that be your starting point. And inevitably your consumers care about different things at different times. And so at one moment in time, you'll be like, right, it's this. And then you start to work out, right, how do we connect them with that impact, with that thing that the consumers care about? And the social impact side of things almost becomes secondary or even tertiary, because your starting point is, how do I connect with my consumers? Instead, if your starting point is like, what do I actually want to change in the world? Then your starting point is the impact that you want to deliver. And I think so many times when we talk about purpose, a business is trying to think about how do they connect with their consumers rather than actually what are we going to try and change in the world and how are we going to stick with it. So that's my like bugbear out of the way. And so for eBay, what that means is, like I said, is how do we support underserved communities? And we've got 3 programs really that we deliver. The first is a program called eBay for Change, which is all about supporting social enterprises to grow and thrive on the platform. So we have a partnership with Social Enterprise UK, which is a big membership body in the UK for social enterprises, and the World Fair Trade Organization, the same for fair trade businesses. And we provide them with the things that we're good at, which is like, how do you grow your business on the platform? So how do you develop those e-commerce skills, try to create connections between social enterprises, all that stuff that we can do around, reduce fees and all that sort of thing, but also presence on the site and our marketing and comms power. So we've worked with about 400 social enterprises so far, which is great. We're 3 years in and continuing to grow that program. So that's the first, and that's really about us saying we believe in this this approach to doing business, which is more inclusive by design. And then our second program is really how do we support entrepreneurs from underserved communities right now, and that's where you can have a bit of a challenge around, which community and why. And for us, it's been around how do we support communities with multiple disadvantage. And so we looked at communities that have sort of disproportionately interested in starting their own businesses, but also disproportionately low business outcomes. And so we work with Black women entrepreneurs and we work with refugee entrepreneurs. And again, similar structure, really about supporting them to grow their business on the platform, demystify e-commerce, all of that sort of stuff. So that's our second program, is really what we would call inclusive entrepreneurship. And then the third, and I'll just be quick, is about supporting charities to do exactly the same. So we have lots and lots of charities. The charity sector in the UK is alive and well and thriving, and many charities are trading on eBay. We raised about 40 million for charities last year. So we have exactly the same program, which is really helping charity shops to develop their skills in selling on eBay. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff around circular economy and re-commerce, which maybe I can touch on a little bit later.
Yes, please. Thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. And a question that I'd love to ask you later on, so I'll give you a bit of warning, is about how you, because so much of the work that you do is with partnerships, is how you find them and how you decide who your partners are. So have a think about that as we move along. But Matty, tell us a little bit about Togetherall, partnering with purpose, and what that means for you, because you're a slightly different type of business.
Yeah, we are. So nice to be here. So Matthew McAvoy is my given name, but most call me Matty. So feel free to do that. I'm the CEO at Togetherall, and as Louise says, a very different kind of business than TELUS or eBay, but a social enterprise at our core, with our kind of singular mission around supporting mental health. And what we've built is a digital, clinically moderated, peer-to-peer community centered around mental health, where members of our community who are struggling with their mental health in one way, shape, or form, whether it's isolation, anxiety, depression, stress, can support one another in a safe environment. We talk about Togetherall being a safe environment because it's moderated and monitored 24 hours a day by registered and licensed mental health professionals. A little bit about our history. We were founded in 2007. So in terms of a digital mental health organization, we've been around quite a while. To put it into context, we came out the same year as the smartphone. So been at it a while. Things have changed in the landscape quite a bit. And we're now available to over 20 million individuals in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and cut across a whole range of different sectors and types of organizations. So employers, insurance companies, colleges and universities, and then broader populations like the NHS. And we're available, I'm Canadian, we're available to all residents in the province of Nova Scotia, for example. And you can really think about us like a social network, essentially, but centered around mental health and safeguarded by mental health professionals 24 hours a day. So really trying to weed out all of the negative things and connotations that kind of come with social networks and giving it a safe place. But as for me, I've spent my entire career in sort of remote-based mental health service delivery in one way, shape, or form. My educational background is in business and psychology. Early on, I think I had the intention of getting my PhD in clinical psychology and delivering kind of one-to-one care. And I think quickly realized that what I was passionate about was definitely helping people and making an impact, but figuring out how to do something larger than just one-to-one service provision and building something that could help people at scale. And so that idea of partnering for purpose, I think kind of comes back to Togetherall, and our origins is out of a partnership. We were actually born out of a grant in the National Health Service in the UK to help reach more and different people than the traditional mental health services kind of face-to-face wander into a clinic were supporting. And specifically, the NHS was looking to address reaching other people in the community who couldn't or wouldn't come for support, whether it be for accessibility reasons, and predominantly at the time related to stigma or culture, where mental health wasn't part of the lexicon in certain parts of the community. And I think at that time they realized they wouldn't be able to do that on their own, and created this grant to build a partnership to access mental health support in more parts of the community. And so when we sort of responded to that grant and built the community, an essential part of the service design from the outset was really beyond the sort of safeguarding, which I've mentioned, which is core, is that our service is anonymous. So when people join, there's always a front door. So we know which organization they're a part of, whether it's a college, the NHS, a province, etc. But they create an anonymous username in our platform. So all the sharing and supporting that happens anonymously. And what that's allowed us to do is reach a really different set of people than come for traditional supports. So, for example, we are overrepresented in our peer community by people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, those who identify as neither male nor female, and actually more men come to Togetherall than traditional mental health services. And about 70% of our membership tell us that they have no other formal form of support beyond Togetherall. And the last thing I'd mention about our business is that it's governed by a charter, which has kind of 3 core areas: access, impact, and self-sufficiency. And access, it's really about providing access to support as many people as we can, regardless of their background, beliefs, or means, without risk of judgment or stigma. And a core part of that means that we don't charge individuals for our service. So there's always a sponsoring organization, so our service is always free to individuals who need it. And the second is impact. So we provide a measurable effectiveness both to individuals using the service, but also to organizations who commission us. And on the financial sustainability side, we've built, if we're delivering on those first 2 points around access and impact, then we won't need to depend on donors or grants in order to survive and thrive and carry on that mission. So that's kind of the third part of the pillar for us.
Thank you, Matty. And I hope you don't mind. I'd like to stay on you for a minute because
Sure.
one of the questions we're interested in this discussion is how you engage authentically. We're talking about authenticity in terms of engagement with your partners, but also how you stay authentic to your mission, because you are a business as well, and you are needing to stay profitable to be able to continue to provide the service that you provide. So can you talk a little bit more about what being authentic means to you and your partnerships,
Sure.
and how you stay authentic?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of things we can get into. I think the first is, because we're at our heart a social network centered around mental health, if people don't feel from the communities that we're trying to serve, feel comfortable using the service or feel that it connects to them where they are, then they won't come and use the service. And if they don't come and use the service, then there's no peer community for people to get support from. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. So it's really critical for us to connect with the communities that we serve, because they're the ones who need to come and use the service. So it's this sort of circular thing, right? And one of the ways that we do that is by actually engaging with members in our community. And I'll give you an example that we've done over the last kind of number of years. So as a Canadian, we had heard and seen across the healthcare system in this country that healthcare workers were, really struggling coming the pandemic, burnout, stress, leaving the profession. And so we wanted to do something for that community. So we engaged with the Canadian Federation of Nurses union and actually spoke to advocates for nursing mental health and said, what is it that is, that would help you? And what we heard pretty loud and clear is traditional mental health services were, not connecting with nurses. They felt like they didn't really understand what they were on about and needed. And so we worked with nurses to say, hey, if we built parts of our community that are going to serve you, what would that look like? And so we spent a few months kind of in consultation with them around what resources and courses and things that we could share. But then what we really got to the heart of is they actually just wanted a safe space to connect with just other nurses. So we built out a part of our platform to serve just nurses. So you have to be a nurse in order to get in and to connect with others. And then they could share sort of the horror stories or the war stories about all the things that have happened to them and kind of support one another. And then when they needed it, our clinical team are there to jump in and support. But we're also a technology company, right? So we're not just building things. So anything that we build always has to have an eye on how are we going to scale this? So the things that we were building, we were thinking, how can we build this specifically for nurses? But then what does that mean for us as a business? Can this apply to other areas? And so this idea of building a community specifically for nurses, we've kind of lifted and shifted to building one for farmers, building one for teachers, building one for the military. And so creating these spaces within our platform to serve these specific groups and then having conversations with them along the way to make sure that what we've built actually is continuing to serve them.
That's great. Thank you, Matty. I'm going to ask that same question actually to you, Marissa, because I know you've put lots of things in place to make sure that you're held to account in the way that you work and act authentically. So could you share a little bit more about that process in your situation?
I love talking about accountability because I think that the work that we do in this space is only as good as your accountability to it. There's a lot of promises that are made and not kept, and we all know that. You see that in government, you see that in businesses, you see that all across the board. And so for us, when we started developing our reconciliation strategy as an organization, we engaged multiple different types of folks to make sure that in the development of our strategy, that our strategy was reflective of both organizational opportunities, but also what we were hearing externally. So what we did is I engaged internally with leadership, I engaged internally with Indigenous peoples within our organization, and then I engaged externally with Indigenous peoples across the country, subject matter experts, elders, and we had these ongoing conversations over a year around building out the strategy, around building out the areas that we felt intersected well with what we were hearing from Indigenous peoples, right? Fundamentally, reconciliation, and I think any kind of social purpose is around listening to those who are telling you what they need and finding out where those intersection points are. And in Canada, we already have a ton of documents or doctrines that were led by Indigenous peoples, very clearly articulating this is how you can support. We have 94 calls to action. We have 231 calls for justice established by the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission, and we have UNDRIP. All three of these have been built by Indigenous peoples and are really clearly articulate how you can support. So over the course of a year, we read these documents, we engaged with Indigenous peoples, we engaged internally, and out of this year-long engagement process, we came up with a strategy that was encompassing of 4 pillars of how our reconciliation strategy was going to be implemented: connectivity, enabling social outcomes, cultural responsiveness in relationships, and advancing economic reconciliation. And then under each of these pillar areas, we came up with a series of commitments and a series of actions. And there, I think we had then our first iteration of a report, it was 19 commitments and actions under these 4 pillar areas. And what we said and what we heard very loud and clear in our engagement is you need to hold yourself accountable. It's so great that you're going to do this. This is fantastic. But how are you going to hold yourself accountable for actually demonstrating that you're doing the things that you're saying you're going to do? So we are doing that in a couple of different ways. One, we do it through an annual report. So our first reconciliation action plan came out at the end of 2021, laying out our commitments and actions and what we were going to do. Every year thereafter, we have provided an update on how we're progressing against each of those commitments and targets and actions that we made, where we're being successful, where we're not, where we're evolving our goals and actions based on the evolution of what we're hearing from community, because again, this is an evolving space. And so every year we provide updates. Last November, we put out our second update on our action plans. But the other thing that we heard is communities get over consulted, right? There's a huge over engagement fatigue. And so how do we make sure that we're keeping in touch with community on our actions without over engaging people? So the other thing that we established was an Indigenous Advisory Council. So we have an advisory council made up of 10 leaders and subject matter experts and youth from across the country. We meet a couple of times a year and speak to them and get guidance and feedback on the evolution of our actions, on new actions, on parts of our business that want to get more involved, and making sure that as we're evolving our commitments, as we're creating new commitments, as we're doing more and more things, that we're doing it lockstep in alignment with Indigenous perspectives. And so I think those 2 accountability mechanisms are really, really, really important to demonstrate that you're doing what you're saying you're going to be doing. And of course, that doesn't preclude the actual on-the-ground engagement that you need to do when you're actually building networks. But that's how we have approached it from a reconciliation strategy perspective. And it's fantastic because you get live feedback on how you're progressing. And you also get live feedback on, hey, have you ever thought of approaching it this way? Right? This is a really cool thing, but have you ever thought of focusing on it this way? Or have you looked at it from this perspective? And so it's been a really great process, but it's not without its challenges. I think that's a really important thing to also talk about. Accountability is really important, but you're going to get challenged and people are going to want to see things differently. And so you're going to need to make sure that as you're developing your strategy, as you're putting these parameters in place, that this is about that 2-way dialogue.
I'm curious, Marissa, in the spirit of like asking questions across the panel, like how do you recruit, or like what's the kind of criteria for that advisory council that you mentioned?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So from a terms of reference perspective, or I guess how did we recruit? We kind of sat down and we said, we want to make sure that our advisory council is representative, and you're never going to get full representation because Indigenous peoples are diverse across the country. But we really sat down and go, well, what do we want to make sure we have on our council? So we want to make sure that we have representation from First Nation people, from Métis people, and from Inuit people, which are 3 different distinct groups that make up the Indigenous population in Canada. We want to make sure that we had gender diversity, not only from a traditional female-male perspective, but from a non-binary perspective. We want to make sure that we had representation from urban and rural as well, because for those that are familiar with Canada, it's a very, very, very big country, and the divide between urban and rural is real, right? There's different needs, actions, wants. So we wanted kind of the geographic split, as well as the rural-urban split. And Maddie, me and my team have strong networks with communities and leaders from across the country, and partnering with one of our board of directors, we started recruiting folks. The other thing that I'll say that we were really clear on is we didn't want politicians on our board. So here in Canada, First Nations, Inuit and Métis are self-governing. They have their own governments, but we made really clear up front that we wanted to make sure this was nonpartisan. And so nobody could be currently on their council or a member of government to join our advisory council. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. More than.
I mean, Chris, I will bring you in 1 second because I know you've got some thoughts on this. But whilst we're on this, Matthew, you also have yours is a guardian council, right, that you work with, and I just wonder, whether you might just talk about that before we go over to Chris, and Chris, you may have this reflection too.
Sure.
But I'm also interested in your last point, Marissa, that you meant who's not on it, who you choose not to have on it. And so maybe you could just tell us what the Guardian Council is, and who's
Yeah.
not, who did you not want on it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Probably lots of people that we didn't want on it, which we could talk about, but I'll talk about who is on it. But the Guardian Council is I think pretty unique in that it's not a board of directors. So I have a separate board of directors that I report to on the performance of the business, but also the purpose of the business. But our Guardian Council is something that we put in place, like as we were growing. How do we stay true to our purpose and our mission, right? If we started out 17 years ago as a grant, partnering with the NHS to extend access to support, how do you keep true to those roots around access and impact? And so in 2020, I guess earlier than that, but in 2020, we formed what we call our Guardian Council. And their role is there's 5 individuals who are separate and distinct from the organization, who are experts across all the areas and geographies in which we serve around mental health. And their sole role is to hold us accountable, like there's that word, Marissa, again, accountability, to the charter that I mentioned before around access, impact, and self-sufficiency. And so those members are, they put out actually a report about Togetherall. We don't do it as a business. Our Guardian Council once a year puts out a report on, are we staying true to our purpose, right? We help inform some of what goes into that, but some of the decisions we make around who do we partner with, who do we accept investment from, where, what geographies do you go into, who do we want to sell our services to, how do we partner with organizations? All of that is sort of governed and overseen by these members of the Guardian Council. And sort of who's on it, we have a retired NHS Trust chair, so kind of representing our health populations in the UK. We have a woman who is the senior program officer of a nonprofit based in the US called Active Minds, that's centered around student mental health. We have a woman who used to work for the Mental Health Commission of Canada, does work with the World Health Organization around workplace mental health, actually helped create the national standard here in Canada around workplace psychological health and safety. And then our last member of the council is the woman who brought mental health first aid to the UK sort of many moons ago. So real experts across a diverse range, all chaired by a fellow by the name of Liam Black, who kind of created this concept and idea for us, and is a 30-year veteran in social impact investing, so on the business side of that. And it's been a really great, I think, tool for us and challenge for us, right? I think accountability is not an easy thing. So when we have kind of really thorny ideas and things that we're grappling with, we bring it to the Guardian Council and get their opinion. And sometimes they say, yeah, that's a great idea. Other times they say, is that really true to your mission? And it's forced us to take some decisions that if we were just a business on our own, that we may not have.
I'm curious, Maddie, because I think one of
Sure.
we didn't talk about this, but I think the terms of reference and your terms of reference for these councils are so important, right? Because I
Absolutely.
think they really make or break the success of them and what people are responsible for versus what they're not. And I think I didn't talk about that, but I'm curious from your perspective, like given that they have to create a report, you must have a really tight terms of reference in terms of what this is versus what this is not.
Yeah. We do. And I think maybe one of the most powerful bits of it is that they are allowed to speak publicly about Togetherall in essentially however they see fit. Right. So these are people who are industry experts who've got great reputations in the space. And so, if we're not holding true, they're gonna say it out loud, and they'll say it out loud in public forums. Right. And so that's, I think, probably the most, when I think about the terms of reference, that term in particular is a really great one to help kind of keep us to account.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll continue to dive into this thing about accountability and the terms of reference around that. But I think, Chris, tell us about how any of this resonates for you? Do you have such a function, and how does that work? And yeah, authenticity as well would be helpful to hear from as well.
Yeah, one, I love the fact the Guardian Council puts out the impact report. So I've written that down. I'm going to steal that. So we have what is more a steering committee made up of program alumni there's 6 to 8 people that we go to every quarter and talk about the program, make program tweaks around it, but really try to understand what's it like for an entrepreneur out there at the moment and the challenges that social enterprises are having. So they input into our programs, and we make adaptations around that. So that's important for us to really get that played back around how the program is working. So that's one thing I think in terms of authenticity. I think the second one is really around the partners that you choose. And I think, Louise, you mentioned how do we find the partners that we work with. I think generally our approach has been to work with like smaller, more agile organizations rather than the larger NGOs that are out there, primarily because we want to develop this thing together. And the challenge when you're working with larger partners is sometimes that you're an account for them, rather than saying like, right, we've got these skills and we've got these tools. You've got these skills and these tools, and this is the needs of the community that we're working with. How do we build something together? So I think the second one is really in that program design, that you're doing that collaboratively, and then that feeds into the monitoring and evaluation process, which again, from a business perspective in this space, can often be produce this report for me, and we'll check in every 3 to 6 months, rather than that process being a shared process and really going through that evaluation work together, which we've made sure that we do across each of our programs. And that gives you that, it actually feels like a partnership rather than a service provider for you as the business. And I think like that's the most important thing in that authenticity, is creating that feeling and that sense that you are in this together, and you're designing it together, you're reviewing it together, and you're developing it together. And I think that's often a challenge for large businesses, particularly when lots of organizations are used to delivering maybe donor-funded initiatives, and you know, have their incubator program that they run, for example, and it's like, right, yes, you're buying into our incubator program, and then we're saying, well, actually, yes, we are coming with money to get this thing off the ground, but we're also coming very clearly with the skill set that we've got as a business, and we want to develop this thing together. And that can sometimes be difficult, I think, for the other side, not just for the business.
Let's just stay on this, and I'll remind, I know there's a couple of questions in the Q&A already, which I'll bring in a second. But I'll remind everyone else, if you have other questions you'd like to ask, please do put them in the Q&A function or in the chat, and I'll make sure I include them. But just another question for you, Chris, building on what you were last talking about, and the difficulty of this, some of the challenges of working in partnership and with other organizations. I wonder whether you might talk a little bit about the social washing, let's just say that, you know, and when which links to accountability and authenticity as well, but it's a slightly different question around where those challenges are in collaboration, and how you avoid assumptions that you're not doing this for the right reasons.
Yeah, I think it's rife. I think is the reality, and I think it's often done not because people for bad reasons. It's because your starting point is wrong, or the starting point, not everyone's on the same page. So if at the start of the process you don't all know within the business why you're doing this work, you're setting yourself up to fail. And you might be sat in an impact team like I am, and you're coming at it with authenticity at the heart. But if, for example, leadership are seeing it as a comms initiative, quite quickly they're going to want to see the PR bump or the comms bump from it. And so I think the biggest pitfall is just not getting everyone on the same page as to why we're doing this work at the outset. And that's like that sounds simple, but it's quite hard because because it's not just you in the impact team or whatever team you're sat in and the leadership. You also want to be able to talk about this work in the right way. And so you've got to involve your marketing and comms colleagues. You've got to involve lots of different functions across the business and make sure that they are fully bought into why you're doing that work. Because also you want to be able to let go of this work at some point. And you have to, like, you can't be doing every function of the business as you're trying to deliver this work. You're trying to work with the partner. You're trying to do the design. You're trying to do the stuff that you're meant to deliver. And other people are delivering those things. And so that's the biggest pitfall, I think. And but equally alongside that, you've got to be willing to let go of it. And I think not let go of the social washing bit, just to be clear, let go of this is your baby, because you need other people buying into it and owning it, because at some point, this has got to move out of your team and move into business as usual. That's always been our focus. Has been, right, we develop and incubate these ideas and these initiatives, and at some point we want to hand them over to, from an eBay perspective, would be our small business team. And that can also be hard because you, in a function like this, can often be fighting for space, fighting for attention, justifying why you're there. Again, if the business isn't quite bought into being a social purpose business, you're fighting for that. So you want to own it and you want to keep hold of it. But it'll die at some point if you don't do it. So I think the biggest pitfall is trying to keep too tight a ownership on it. You need to let people run with it, but also you've got to get everyone on the same page at the start.
If I can add, I think the distribution of ownership is so important, because I find that, so in the reconciliation space, one of the things that we were really cognizant of when we built our strategy was that my team can't own it, right? We are the backbone. We can support the organization. We can make sure that we're reporting out and we're accountability. But at the end of the day, the different business units have to be responsible for implementing things related to it, right? It's about ensuring that, like, the social purpose part of the organization can be providing that backbone, but how do we integrate it into the rest of the organization? One of the things that we did is we have primes or leads from across our organization, and I went, where are the intersections between reconciliation and your business? What can you drive forward? How do you advance reconciliation through your business unit? Because I can't own it. I can't own everything, because we're never going to make change. We're never going to create difference. Things will never move forward if it's only owned by one select group of people. It needs to be owned across the organization. And I agree, Chris, like, to me, that is like one of the most fundamental pieces of this work, is that it needs to be inherently owned by everybody and not just one small business unit. And I'll give you an example of that. So for us, there's something here in Canada called placemaking, right? So how do we ensure that our buildings, for example, like a real estate asset, is appropriately acknowledging the traditional territory of those whose lands that we're on? And so our real estate team decided that, as part of their commitments, they were going to work to do placemaking in our buildings as we renovate them. So what does that mean? They built a budget. They engage with the communities in the area, and they are now actually updating key buildings to be inclusive of the perspectives of the Indigenous peoples from that area, through art, through placemaking, through land acknowledgements. But they own this process. They own this project. It is a real estate owned project, not my project. It's real estate owned. So it's just like an example of how that's embedded into other parts. And I resonate so much with that comment, Chris, because it's the only way to make these things successful.
I'll give a little my perspective here too. It's, we are our purpose, like, we are a social enterprise, true to the core, right, of helping mental health of the people around us. But even still, right, when we move beyond that sort of grant and the size where you couldn't no longer get everybody in the same room on the same page for collaboration and rah, let's carry on with the mission. We're a really distributed organization now in tons of countries all over the world. And that was kind of the core of embedding the Guardian Council, was to take it out of the hands of anyone in particular within the organization and sort of write it into the articles of the organization that this Guardian Council is here to hold us accountable to the mission. So even in a business like ours, which is centered around the social purpose in and of itself, for its existence, like, still required that. So no matter what happens down the road, we'll stay true to that. We'll stay true to that mission. So it's even hard for organizations like us.
I'm going to ask you a question, if you don't mind changing tact a little bit, from the Q&A, from the participants. And one of them was the first one is how you measure the impact of the partnering work that you do, and what are the parameters that you have around impact measurement. So that's one question. And then a second one is, and you can answer either one that you prefer, is around who do you refer to for standards and I'm going to add inspiration for or guidance on your partnering with purpose initiatives. So where are you going to get those kind of ideas from? And please feel free to take each other's ideas during this too. But yeah, jump in, whoever would like to start on one of those.
So I can go on.
Thanks, Chris.
Just on, if I got the second one right, on the inspiration point, I think for us, and it comes down to, like, again, how we find partners. It's just about having those conversations with people that are working on these issues day to day. It's like, it's honestly as simple as that, I think. We don't come up with a strategy ourselves and say, right, this is exactly what we want to do. It's just about getting out there and speaking to people working on, for example, refugee rights, and understand what the challenges that refugees are facing in developing their own businesses. And it's not more sophisticated than that in terms of inspiration. And then in terms of reporting, for us, it's like we're doing it on a pretty regular basis. So we're getting updates weekly, but then we'll do a sort of full review on a quarterly basis, and looking really at, like, skills acquisition, confidence, and then business growth for us is the main things. Hopefully that answered it.
One of the ways that we think about, like, if we're thinking about a particular subset of a population that we want to support, we've built a really nice model where we find a nonprofit who really cares deeply about the space. So, it was the Canadian Federation of Nurses, the example I gave earlier. We've got a relationship with an organization called the Do More Ag Foundation in Canada, who are centered around supporting the mental health of farmers and agricultural workers across this country. And then lean into their sort of really specific industry or sector knowledge to say, hey, let's build something together in the way that I spoke about before, involving, farmers in that discussion. But then how are we going to fund this in a sustainable way? And so through kind of their connections, we've reached out to organizations who are committed to the success of the agriculture industry, beyond just the PR announcement that you might get from supporting a mental health community, right? We want those kinds of organizations who are going to fund it, but also help us promote and get the word out, right? So that we can achieve the access part of our mission. So I think we've found nonprofits as a really great partner to help us navigate the landscape of who's here for the right reasons to fund these sorts of initiatives, and who's there for the social washing side, rather than trying to figure it out in each sector on our own. We just wouldn't have the bandwidth for that. And of course, the Guardian Council comes into play there. But that's been a really effective way of it's partnering with other social impact organizations to help us weed through those who are committed and those who are not.
I think, I've talked a lot about accountability and talking about the impact of our work through our reports that we do annually. One of the things that I was thinking about in the context of this was the program that I talked about at the top of the call, which is our Indigenous Mobility for Good for Indigenous women at risk of or surviving violence, right? It's a great example of a program that for us, we needed to make sure that if we were going to be giving phones and plans to women who are at risk of surviving violence, we needed to partner with the right organizations who were able to get the phones in the hands of women that needed it. And so for us, we really sat down and went, well, who's at the front line? Who is on the front line? Who's doing the work? Similar to what Maddie said and similar to what Chris has said, like, who are the organizations doing the work, and gain the guidance from those organizations around who's doing the work, I think is really, really, really important. We need to, like, I think as organizations, we tend to want to be everything to everybody, or we want to be like, oh, we know what's best. But at the end of the day, we need to really trust in the partners and making sure that the partners we are partnering with are able to tell us, you know, this is the right way to do it, or this is the wrong way to do it. You really should be thinking about doing it this way. And I'm going to give an example of how do you measure impact, because I think it's an interesting question. So this program that I'm talking about, Mobility for Good for Indigenous Women at Risk of or Surviving Violence, when we first started talking about, some of the conversations were, oh, it's going to help women get out of violence, or, oh, it's going to, you know, help women when she's in a dangerous situation. But when you actually get down to like and start to unpack what it's doing so many different things, right? It's working as a harm reduction tool, right? If a woman has a phone in a moment, and if she sells that phone, and as a result of selling that phone, that means she doesn't have to put herself in a dangerous situation for 6 days, is that a good outcome of the program? Right. So I think there's some really interesting questions. And when we look at it from a binary kind of corporate perspective, you're like, well, but that's not the point of the phone. The point of the phone is she has a phone to call people for help. But for that woman in that moment, she was able to provide for her family. She was able to provide for herself for a weekend and remove herself from dangerous situations. So I think that I don't think there's an easy answer sometimes to measuring impact, because impact, what we think of here, is very different from what impact on the ground could be or looks like. And we need to rely on the organizations that were partnering us to say what good impact is versus what like the pretty corporate image could be.
I love that, Marissa. I think that's such a wonderful lesson. And I think what it shows is, and this really links to one of the questions that has just been asked, is around, well, I'll say it as it is, but someone asked, says the vulnerability that comes with accountability we're speaking about is not necessarily the culture of that business. And this is exactly what you were just saying, you know, it's changing the internal culture. So what kind of things do you do to get to that point, to bring your teams along, to have that kind of really different conversation about impact, and understand that it's not just that corporate shiny thing, but there's something deeper and more human in there. So yeah, tell us a little bit about what kind of things you can do to get to that point with your teams.
I don't think there's a magic answer to this question. Like, I'm just going to say it. I don't think that there is like a silver bullet answer to this question. I think it's time, and it's conversation, and it's consistent conversation. And I think it's getting leadership on the ground in communities, whatever your area is, and helping people to see firsthand what the implications or the benefits of these things are. That to me is it's a lot of consistent ongoing dialogue and slowly moving the needle. I don't, you know, it's a lot of work, and you just have to keep having the conversations. You have to keep moving the needle here. You know, one of the things I haven't talked about, but one of the core of what we do, is we connect communities. I was listening to Maddie and Chris talking at the beginning about the great work that you do, and I kept thinking about, it's great, but only if the communities you're supporting have access to internet, right? Or have access to, and in Canada, that's a real problem. It's a big country with multiple people spread out. It is very expensive to build to remote communities. And so for you know, sorry, I kind of diverted there, but for me, it's making sure that our leadership understands what the connectivity is bringing in community, right? Bringing leadership out to community when they get community for the first time, connectivity, excuse me, for the first time. We work with communities that have been on satellite internet, right? For forever, right? And we're going from satellite internet to like advanced broadband fiber optic to the home connectivity, right? So it's making sure to bring your leadership into community, have the conversations, learn about the culture of the community, learn about what's happening, learn about the differences that these are making. Like, it's just these ongoing consistent steps that you need to take. So I know I kind of took a circular route there, but
I completely agree with what Marissa said then, but also I think one good thing is always to get your leadership to have to represent the work, whether that's in media or if that's in some other way, because that's the moment in which you've got to really engage with it beyond the metrics that they might have been fed up to whenever. So I think that's one way to accelerate. And the second one I would just say is quite eBay specific, but eBay, one of the most powerful things in the culture at eBay is that we have what we call communities of inclusion or communities of interest. And so there are many of these. For example, Black employees at eBay, we have a women at eBay, we have our Pride group, we have lots and lots and lots. And they hold quite a lot of power within the business, actually, and connecting the work that we do with these sort of self-organized employee groups really gets buy-in from this from this group that is meeting regularly, and that's been a real help for us to get another perspective on the work that we're doing, get other champions and ambassadors on it as well, and people that are disproportionately interested in it, I would say. Oh, can't hear you, Louise.
Oh, thank you. Someone had to do it. I'll take the hit. Before we go on to Matty, and I'm really interested in this question around vulnerability and how you're bringing people along in your team. I just wonder, Chris, maybe you could say a little bit about, it's another question as well around power imbalances and how, because you are doing this conversational thing and engaging with people, but you are coming from a very large company with a lot of power that others don't have. So I just wonder whether you might say a little bit about that and the kind of community engagement, and then Matty will come back to you and talk more about.
Yeah, again, Marissa started the other one. There's no silver bullet. The reality is you've got to be aware of it. Like, there's power imbalances when we're speaking to partners. The partners need money. They see a big business coming in that they think we've got money. It's the same whenever we're with any of the communities that we're working with. I think one of the very basic things is just showing up consistently as a human face rather than this sort of soulless corporate that is what I see in a lot of initiatives that are happening. Makes a huge difference, and being clear about right, this is what we're offering, this is what we're not offering, this is how we're going to work with partners throughout this, providing that transparency to anyone on the programs and having that space for them to ask questions, to push back, to ask for things. We build that into all of our programs, but the power imbalance, obviously still remains. But I think building trust in the individuals that are leading the program is probably the key thing, so that people feel comfortable sharing what isn't working and what is working. And that, again, that just takes time, and it takes effort to show up consistently, I think.
Can I just add a quick comment about the power imbalance? I think it's about recognizing the power imbalance. I totally agree, Chris. I think it's also about how do you take that powerful platform that you have as in eBay or a TELUS and use it for good, right? So you have a massive platform as an organization. What are we doing as organizations to support the outcomes of the communities that we're serving, to use that platform to drive outcomes? And so you may see, I don't know if you can see, I have a moose hide pin on. So and it's a campaign to stand up against violence against Indigenous women and girls, and to really change how we talk about healthy masculinity in here. And so as a partner, it's about how do I use my power to get the message out about this campaign, which means getting moose hide into all the stores across the country. It's talking with our partners to say, how are you talking about moose hide? How are you getting involved in this campaign? It's about getting our leaders to post about it and getting people to think about it, right? It's how do we almost inverse flip it and take our platform and support others to access our platform to drive good. So I think there's a couple ways to think about it. And that's something that I'm always talking about with my team. We have so much power as an organization. How are we flipping it on its head and using that power and giving it as a platform to others that don't have the same platform or the same access as us? So just a quick topic on that.
One other quick one on that, and then I will shut up. Is on the biggest risk comes at the point in which you start to talk about the work that you're doing, and that's an obvious point. But making sure that people are comfortable about the way they're being represented in those communications, because that's all trust can go at the moment in which that's done in the wrong way. And I think that's a critical point, is getting your marketing and comms teams to really understand, really engage, because they are the ones that are going to be driving that comms.
We've gone a different way, and we're going to stay here because I mean, I could have this conversation with you three for a very long time, but unfortunately we only have 10 minutes ish left. And so what I'd like to do is actually kind of build on your last point there, Marissa, but I'll come to you, Matty, first on this, around how we build more of a collective movement around this kind of work and the idea of partnering with purpose. There are many companies, not just the three of you, that do this well, but there are many that don't do it at all. And I'm interested in how we can, so we talked about internal culture, how we can build a bigger culture and movement around this work, and use the power that you have and the relationships that you have with other companies to get more of this partnering with purpose type of activities happening. So Matty, tell us how we build more of a movement on this, and what advice you give to other businesses who might not know where to start.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually will kind of come back to echo a point that Chris made sort of straight away at the beginning, is to be really clear about what you are trying to change, right? And not kind of what your consumers want. I really liked, Chris, how you framed that at the beginning. And you have to believe in it across the organization, and then project that outwards and be consistent with it, right? I think, we've kept to our singular focus around access and impact around mental health, and have consistently been talking about that and beating the proverbial drum for that for such a significant period of time. And it is finding organizations who will also, beat to that same tune, right? And finding the partners who really embody what, if you're really clear about what you want, you can find those partners who also are clear about those sort of same things. We don't have you talking about the power imbalance. We're still a relatively small organization, certainly compared to eBay and to TELUS, but we can help use our singular focus and help kind of drive our mission with much larger partners. Most of the partners that we have are, far larger than us, and help shout about this mission around access and impact in mental health from the rooftops in ways that are, much broader and bigger than we can. And I think that's a huge part around partnering with purpose.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you all actually as a final question to close on, about where you get your inspiration for this kind of work. And I'm sure it's with your partners, but a bit more specifically, this is a challenging time for us everyone in the world right now, and sometimes everything feels a little hopeful. And I find it very inspirational hearing all of you and what you're doing, and the work that you engage in, and it gives me hope for the way of what's possible. But where do you get your inspiration, and how do you keep pushing? Because I'm sure you tell us these stories, but actually you're up against bigger forces in all of your work, so there's something that keeps you all going. So tell us how you tell us a bit more about that, where you get your energy from. Matty, what?
Couple of two things. One is at a sort of regular interval internally, because I run the business side of this as well as sort of the purpose side. Is we have our kind of frontline clinical folks who are moderating the conversations, and one of the reasons we have licensed and registered clinicians doing the work is because people come into our community and talk about things like self-harm and suicide. And so a regular feature of sort of our company town halls are a story that happened, within the last kind of few weeks. And inevitably, it's a really significant story where our clinical team has intervened when someone has talked about actively harming themselves or taking their own life. And it's like, that is the mission and the purpose and why we're here. And it energizes the whole organization to be like, yes, we can get through this really difficult contract renewal or, delayed billing, like all the parts of an organization that exist that are here. So I think we do that on a regular basis because that fuels just about everybody who works for us, no matter what the function, is connected to the mission. So that helps just kind of remind people why we're here. And then I think what kind of gives me hope, speaking from a mental health perspective, is, there is a real sea change. And I think, I've been in this industry a long time, and the pandemic, the very thin silver lining here is the spotlight that the pandemic shone on mental health and isolation, and it didn't create it. It's been here a long time, right? The challenges that we're all struggling with. And I think seeing the change in people, the way that they talk about mental health, the openness that's coming, the younger generation that are very comfortable saying, yeah, I'm not feeling great today. How can you help me with this? Or I need some help is really a powerful thing that I've been, kind of fighting against my whole career. And then, even the Surgeon General in the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, putting out a report about the epidemic of loneliness that's happening in the US. And so it's funny to see inspiration about that, right? Because it's a huge problem, but that it's being talked about so openly, I think, gives me a lot of hope that we can move the needle on that.
That's great. Thank you, Matty. Chris, where do you get your hope?
I loved Matty's response. So it's going to be not as good as that. Mine honestly comes from the fact that I think the reality is business is really powerful, and marketing and advertising got us into, in many ways, the mess that we're in right now. And I guess very simply, my hope is that maybe marketing and advertising can get us out of the mess that we're in as well. And I think that that gives me inspiration. And I think I used to work at Ben & Jerry's, so I was at Ben & Jerry's for 5 years, and used to see like the power of a business speaking out very vocally around an issue that's completely unrelated to its business, and engaging with people that maybe wouldn't engage in that subject. And I think that, like, knowing that business has that power and it can be used in the right way, gives me inspiration.
Thanks, Chris. And Marissa?
I think that I have a couple different thoughts about this. One is, one of the things that I learn, so I'm learning all the time. I'm consistently in community, learning from community. And the one of the common things that I hear is, this isn't about us. It's not about today, it's about future generations, right? It's about driving and creating change for future generations. And I think that's what keeps me going, right? It's how do we make sure that we're going to be a good ancestor, right? How do we make sure that the work that we're doing is creating collective change for all of us? And you can look yourself in the mirror and say, we are creating better change for the future generations. I think that's a really big piece, and it's of what drives me. I think the other thing is I spend a lot of time in community and seeing the difference that the work that we collectively do in community is making, right? I work with one community, and we were able to bring fiber to the premise. So basically, like, fiber optic all the way to each of the homes in this community that was 4 hours away from the nearest town. And as a result of that, not a single kid was left behind during COVID from a schooling perspective. Every single kid was able to go to school through the pandemic and did not get left behind. That is not insignificant, right? It is not insignificant. And it's so important for the future generations. And so I think that's what kind of keeps me going is what the tangible real-time impacts are being made on the ground for community, and what that means for this younger generation, but also the future generations.
Well, I love that you left us on that, Marissa. I mean, at Six, we're so committed to uh, uh, the work, the idea of business as a force for good, and having more conversations around this, but also young people and their next generations that we're doing any of this work for. And we're particularly interested in how businesses are engaging young people in their practices and in these kind of partnerships that we're talking about. So we'd be very pleased to I mean, share more of this and keep watching for Six for more conversations around that space. So thank you for leaving us with that point of hope. I'd love to have given you more chance to ask questions to each other and give remarks to each other. But I think we've already had our time, and I really appreciate how much you did engage with each other as well. So many things you need to say. Matty, do you want to say something else?
No, I was just going to say thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks to each of you. And thanks to everyone who signed in and listened along. And yeah, watch this space. There'll be more of this kind of conversation. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are. And we'll be in touch.